The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand, and we gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise, to get what we want, we got to organize.
Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Pantsula podcast. This is episode 104. It's been a long time coming, but we are glad that you're here to listen. And this episode of our podcast, we are going to be talking about imperialism in Africa, the history and its current impact. We're going to get into the definitions while also providing context and why it's necessary for the world to understand what imperialism is. We hear a lot about capitalism, which is the dominant system in the world, where profits mean more than people, but not much is said about the finance capital that speaks to raw materials sourced from stolen land. And that is what this podcast is going to be about. History must be examined from a nation, class, and gender analysis. If we are trying to understand our current condition, we must be aware of its beginnings and how the expansion of neocolonialism is, in effect, as Kwame Nkrumah identifies it, the last stage of imperialism. But before we get into this topic with my comrades, we're going to start with our introductions. So, we are organizers with the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which was founded by Kwame Nkrumah in 1968. The objective of the A-APRP is Pan-Africanism, which we define as the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. If you have any questions about what this means, please reach out to us at our website at aaprp-intl.org. We believe in a free Africa under scientific socialism. That is what Pan-Africanism is, and that is what we strive to get. This is our objective. Before we get into the conversation about imperialism, we're going to firstly honor our ancestors, because we understand that without our ancestors, there would be no us. And the two ancestors we're honoring today would be Franz Fannon and Marie Clara de Pitt Walker Johnson. Franz Fannon studied under the poet Aimé Césaire. Under Césaire, a man who asserted Black dignity through his concept of negritude, Fanon's understanding of his identity dramatically shifted. His studies had previously favored European and French worldviews, but from Césaire, Fanon felt himself more and more linked to his African roots. He wrote some of the most important books which gave voice to the Third World liberation struggles of that time. Books like Black Skin, White Mask, The Wretched Earth, A Dying Colonialism, and Toward the African Revolution. With as varied disciplines as psychology, sociology, economics, and politics, all of Fanon's work grappled with social justice and racism on an internal level, as well as in the interaction between the colonizers and the colonized. The second ancestor we're honoring again is Marie Clara de Pitt Walker Johnson, who was a civil rights activist in Oakland, California during the 1960s. Marie served as a secretary of several Oakland and East Bay area organizations, including the local welfare rights organization, Citizens for Equal Opportunity, and the Ralph S. Williams Campaign Committee. Also one of the oldest members of the Black Panther Party, she joined Strikes for Justice. In addition, she was a founding member of the Committee for Children and founding secretary of Blacks United to Promote Progress, also known as BUMP. In 1969, Johnson co-founded the revolutionary feminist anti-war group Woman Power, which said that the U.S. government had relinquished its right to rule, and she called for a revolution. So again, we honor every day our ancestors who are committed to the struggle, even if they are not well known. Ashe, ashe, ashe. So before we further deeper into this podcast, we want to start off with a few definitions of what imperialism is. I'm going to be taking from two definitions, one from Walter Rodney and How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and another from Kwame Nkrumah. So what Walter Rodney says is that imperialism is expanded capitalism, the penetration of foreign capitalism on a worldwide scale. It meant that European, Japanese, and North American capitalists were forced by the internal logic of their competitive system to seek abroad. opportunities to control raw materials, supplies, define markets, and profitable fields of investment. And what Kwame Nkrumah says, the fortunes of the African Revolution are closely linked with the worldwide struggle against imperialism. It does not matter where the battle erupts, be it in Africa, Asia, or Latin America. The mastermind and master, hand at work, are the same. The oppressed and the exploited people are striving for their freedom against exploitation and suppression. So, as we know from what Kwame Nkrumah said, imperialism is defined as the highest stage of the development of capitalism. Capitalism is the economic system that allows private individuals to own and control the means of production, be it mines, mills, banks, factories, or forests, and accumulate this wealth from the labor of workers who receive less than the value of their labor. Understanding capitalism on its most basic level helps one understand imperialism as a worldwide exploitation and oppression of the non-imperialist countries, like the global south, aka the third world. Under imperialism, each major power has carved out a niche of the world to exploit and still maintains irrepressible need to expand. Monopoly capitalism being finance capital and generation of profits from imperial colonialism as the final stage of capitalist development to ensure greater profits. So it is the exportation and investment of capital to countries with underdeveloped colonies. It is the requirement of monopolies of labor and natural resource exploitation and the expiration of finance capital to sustain colonialism. Also, with imperialism, we have the collaboration of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. These institutions are used to serve imperialism and to keep the colonies broke and dependent on foreign aid. And as we are witnessing, the most effective push for imperialism has been neocolonialism, where a segment of the colonized population ultimately becomes the new managers under the system of a national pseudo-bourgeois and petty bourgeois, the willing black and brown figureheads for the capitalist imperialist system. That's what we talk about when we're talking about the bourgeois. It is a lack of understanding of these systems, capitalism, imperialism, settler colonialism, and neocolonialism, that contributes to not only what we're facing as Africans in the US, but the inability for us to connect these struggles globally. The US is a settler colony built on the genocide of indigenous people of Turtle Island and the enslavement of Africans brought to the land through the transatlantic slave trade. Yet broadly on the left, settler colonialism is deemed insignificant. Settler colonialism is a project intended to completely replace indigenous population with a settler one by any means necessary, as to legitimize and continue in perpetuity the theft of land and resources. The imperialist powers uses loans which removes subsidies from food, education, and healthcare. The only way that we are going to protect our land is by a United States of Africa, one that is socialist. And to further this conversation, I will hand it over to my comrade, Winfred.
One could ask, how was Europe able to enforce imperialism in Africa? There are a variety of answers, and one vital reason is from the centuries long ideological unity of European nations when it came to exploiting African labor, resources, and people. Through the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery, starting from the 1500s, European people and nations stole millions of Africans from their homelands and forced them to develop European economies and industrialization. This slave trade fueled war and destruction across many societies in Africa and prevented many nations from developing to the extent that they could have. After trading slaves across continents became less profitable for European nations, they focused more on stealing land, resources, and labor from Africa by forcing more of the Africans who remained in their homelands. Many African societies resisted and waged wars against the European nations, but the centuries of European exploitation across the world allowed for Europe to have more of the wealth, technological advancements, and weaponry that aided in their victory in these wars. This allowed European nations to further expand their empires into Africa. Fortunately, the masses of many African nations successfully fought for their legal independence from Europe. But the over 500 years of exploitation still has an impact today. And the US and Europe continues to exploit African countries through means such as monopoly capitalism, imperialism, and neocolonialism. One might ask, if African nations are legally independent from traditional European colonialism, how does the US and Europe control and exploit Africa today? They do so by controlling the decisions of African nations' elites and politicians. One example is through wars, invasions, and paramilitary interventions to replace leaders that don't act in the interest of European nations. A second example is through sanctions against nations that don't accept the US status quo. A third example is through structural adjustment programs. These are often policy requirements for the loans and financial support needed to purchase the materials that African nations don't currently produce enough of. Africans don't produce enough of these resources for Africans because the resources and technological development needed to do so has been exported to American and European nations for centuries. Structural adjustment programs force African nations to create policies that act in the interests of European and US hegemony. These policies often include exporting more African raw materials from Africa to Europe and the US, and opening African markets to European and US goods. This continues the cycle of exploitation and lowers the chances of African self-determination. Today, the centuries of imperialism means that Africa is technologically underdeveloped in the sense that it doesn't create the technologies and everyday items that are necessary for modern daily life. It means that resources and land in Africa is often owned by those not interested in the development of Africa. As a result, these African resources aren't utilized for the development of the continent. It means that the political and economic decisions in the country are shaped less by the interests and needs of the masses of the people in the country or the continent of Africa, and shaped more by the interests of other nations and corporations. It means increased landlessness among Africans living in Africa, wars, forced migration, increased sexual violence, enforced gender roles, and the dehumanization of and discrimination against Africans across the world. Now that we know a bit more about how imperialism has functioned in Africa the past several centuries, next we'll talk more about the history of imperialism in antiquity.
Thank you, Winfred. So, as Winfred stated, we're going to get into the difference of imperialism and how it operated in antiquity versus how it operates today. So, as you can see on the screen, I have a few quotes from the likes of Kwame Ture, Danny Nabudere, and Vladimir Lenin. But briefly, just to kind of give an overview before I just, give you guys the quotes. So the difference between what imperialism was practiced in ancient times and today is back in the day, for instance, if you take like the Greek or Roman empires, it was really based off just expanding that empire. Obviously capitalism wasn't in play. You just had feudal rule, right? So empires are looking to conquer more territory, create vassal states and whatnot. Versus today, in modern imperialism, as my comrades have laid out, you have the emergence over the past centuries of finance and industrial capital, right? So basically, you have banks and industrial institutions kind of a driving force for economies and subjugating other states, essentially. So now that I laid that foundation, I could probably go into these definitions. So Kwame Nkrumah stated, modern imperialism, however, must be distinguished from that of the ancients, exemplified by Caesar and Alexander the Great. Neither the Norman conquest nor the annexations of Frederick the Great nor the expansions of the American pioneers into the Western Plains can be called imperialism. But the annexation of one nation or state by another, and application of a superior technological strength by one nation for the subjugation and the economic exploitation of a people or another, constitutes outright imperialism. Danny Nebuderi stated, for Lenin, however, the main characteristic distinguishing modern imperialism from the old was that for the first time in history, the whole world was divided up among the financial oligarchy of the powerful states. So that in the future, only redivision was possible. Lenin stated, these monopolies are most firmly established when all sources of raw materials are controlled by one group. And we have seen with what zeal the international capitalist combines extent every effort to make it impossible for their rivals to compete with them. So that is another aspect of what modern day capitalism is too, is monopoly capitalism, where you have a handful of financial or just multinational, transnational institutions controlling and running things across the world. So I actually want to get into this slide and the next slide and into some myths that have been conjured up, mostly by Western countries, which is usually led by the United States. And one of them is why Russia is not imperialist. According to Lenin's definition of imperialism, Russia does not meet the criteria because, according to Forbes magazine in 2020, amongst the world's 2,000 largest publicly traded companies, the highest placed Russian firm is the gas corporation called Gazprom, which is ranked in the 32nd place. So obviously, they're not one of the main industrial organizations around the world, nor do they have the financial capital, nor is it a part and parcel of Russian policy, since the emergence of the USSR and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union as well, to be imperialist. Nor do they have the means to financially to engage in such endeavor. Imperialist countries typically show a marked bias towards sales of sophisticated, high-value merchandise, of knowledge-intensive technical services, and also of financial services. Here too, Russia bears the mark of the periphery. Services in 2013 provided a low 11.8% of total Russian export sales, and in this area, the country ran a massive deficit. So now the next one is China. So I think that's the one we probably all hear the most in terms of being quote unquote imperialist. So here's a quote that I have here, of several quotes. Of the foreign investment in Africa's oil, gas, and mineral resources industries, 70% comes from the US, the UK, France, Australia, and Canada combined, whereas less than 10% from China. But it's led by the Western nations of the world that we see that they pretty much run things when it comes to subjugating other countries due to hegemony. So we have another quote here. China provided $75 billion in aid to Africa, helping it build roads, bridges, hospitals, and schools, and drill wells. China has invested and built infrastructure in countries in Africa that are not minerally rich, for example, Ethiopia. And also when we talk about like U.S. or military bases in general, U.S. has over 800 military bases in over 70 countries versus China's single military base in Djibouti. According to John Hopkins, 80% of workers on Chinese projects in Africa are African. So once again, this is just proof to show that China is not engaging in the same manner as these imperialist Western countries are in Africa. The ventures don't come with straddling countries in debt. We've actually seen countries like Libya that after the overthrow of Gaddafi and the John Maria of straddling the country in debt, enforcing any type of slave market, slave trade, or anything like that.
So with this conversation, obviously, we are not able to go into the depths and the deeper conversations of what imperialism is, because that would take longer than just a Zoom session. But we do encourage you all to do more reading and to clearly, as we say all the time, join an organization. We can see what's going on in Occupy Palestine with the Zionists of Israel, that imperialism should be understood. I mean, I'm sure you all have seen, comrades, just the conversation that's around this, seemingly distant from the historical reality. But we got to do our research, we got to do our study and reading so that we understand what imperialism is and the impact that it's having on us. So we hope that you all are encouraged to do that. We know that this conversation is just hopefully a trampoline for you all to do more study, to do more research, to know just the power and the significance of what imperialism is. But we thank you for listening and for joining. Like we said earlier, our website is aaprp-intl.org. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Kaji, KAJI-AAPRP. Also subscribe to our other channels with the Forward Ever podcast on Spotify, the official page of the A-APRP, AAPRP-INTL. And there's also the Southwest YouTube page that we have programs. We have a lot of different programs where we try to provide political education that will encourage you to do organization, because we know that that is the only way we can get out of the situation. Any more comments and thoughts, comrades, to this conversation and what we know about imperialism?
Thank you all for tuning in. We also encourage you guys to join an organization fighting for justice, whether it's the A-APRP or another organization where you engage with this with other folks and improve yourself and sharpen yourself ideologically, and also do work on the ground to fight against imperialism.
Absolutely. And as we always say, forward ever, backwards never.
Forward.
Forward.